Growing up in Zimbabwe was a very traditional way of learning. Everything was mostly rote learning. So you read a book, you're taught by the teacher, and you had to apply it exactly the way it was expressed. Thinking outside how the teacher thought or the textbook was not encouraged. There was a well-trodden path you had to follow. The reason that was there was that this was the context of survival. There was a path to actually live a quality life in Zimbabwe. If you wanted to become a lawyer, you had to do English literature, geography, history. If you wanted to do medicine, you did maths, physics, and chemistry. Mixing any of those subjects was forbidden. You couldn't do English literature, maths, and physics. That was unheard of. So that was an untrodden path to a future that would not materialize. You couldn't get a profession with that. You couldn't get into a particular university with that particular combination of subjects. So I had grown up in a context where there was a specific narrow path that the whole country had to follow. That path was not for me. That path was constraining and suffocating. I could not bear it. It was a huge burden. It felt claustrophobic for me. So coming to Australia was very different. There wasn't this narrow path to follow. It was really a creation and a path that you could create for yourself and invent for yourself. That was scary for me, even though I really, really wanted it, because I had been trained that there was this narrow path to follow. So in Australia, there were things that I really wanted to explore. I really wanted to explore the performing arts. I really wanted to explore singing. I really wanted to explore the possibility of pursuing science or literature. I had all those desires inside of my heart, but what constrained me was my limiting belief of the narrow path to follow. Because if I were to explore and be adventurous, I had no idea what that would lead to. I had no modeling around it, because in Zimbabwe, I'd only seen the modeling on this narrow path to follow. Coming to Australia was no doubt an adventure, full of possibility, full of hope, but there were things that also shocked me. I got to realize that what my value system was also very different from other people's value systems. And I had to reflect on that. It was a shock to me. One of the shocks for me was that coming from Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe is predominantly a Christian country, and so most people go to church. Coming to Australia, most people were secular and most people don't go to church. And so I was like, don't you know that you won't be going to heaven if you don't go to church? I was so shocked that I was coming to a country that was highly developed, but where the people were not connected to their spirituality or to Christianity. That was a shock to me. Another thing that shocked me was when I would go out with my friends. So I did get invited to house parties, which was fun, but I was so shocked to see people drinking alcohol. People from 14 years old all the way to 18 years old were drinking alcohol. And guess what? Some of them were smoking too. That was shocking for me. In Zimbabwe, growing up as a teenager, none of my friends drank and none of my friends smoked. You just did not do that. People who typically drank alcohol were people who were in the shanty towns and also people who were kind of losers in life. And there was no way you would risk spending time drinking and smoking, because there was this narrow path to follow that determined the rest of your life. So coming to Australia, I was so shocked to see people drinking alcohol and smoking, and let alone their parents allowing it. That was shocking to me. Another thing that was shocking to me was that teenagers and kids had their own voice. They would actually talk back to their parents. That was shocking to me. In Zimbabwe, typically kids and teenagers never talked back directly to their adults. That was forbidden. You would get beaten up for that. That was something where you would get in trouble for. You may not agree with your parents' point of view, but you suffered in silence. What an adult said is what went. In Australia, that wasn't the case. Kids were talking back to their parents and parents were accommodating. That was shocking for me. Another time when my community empowered me to have permission to pursue what I wanted was actually being part of the church choir. At that time, I was attending Crossway Baptist Church, and a huge mega church in Australia, and particularly in Melbourne, with over 1,000 people attending on a regular basis. And I just really loved the songs. After all, I'd been singing some of the songs back home in Zimbabwe, particularly the Hillsong songs. And I said to Andrew, I'd love to be part of the choir, and if not, being a backing vocalist. But I'd never had any singing lessons. Everybody seemed to have singing lessons that I was coming across. And how could I fit inside of not being musically trained? Andrew just told me to go for it. He told me just go for the audition, sing, and see what will happen. So my heart racing as usual as I'm getting out of my comfort zone. Boom, 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 boom. And I go up to Denise Ham, who was the leader for the choir, and I said to her, I'd like to audition to become a backing vocalist. She arranged a day and a time, and I meet up with her after several days, and I sing. I don't believe I sang in Q at all. I don't even know what the musical language is. That's how bad it was. But I just sang, and she said to me that there was some work to do, and that I would be part of the training to become a backing vocalist, which I did. And over time, I actually led people into worship. Now, that would never have happened if Andrew hadn't, again, encouraged me, gave me permission to go and explore being a backing vocalist. Another time when I was given permission to pursue something that mattered to me was even just choosing my clothes. I didn't have many clothes when I came to Australia, and we were living with this gentleman called Sean, and he took me to my first day of shopping. It was in this big warehouse, and which I now know are called DFOs. We had nothing like that in my small city in Mataria of population 300,000. And here I am in this huge warehouse with shops that sold shoes, clothes, food. It was amazing. You know, it was mind-boggling to see so many unique shops under the same roof. Now, as we were walking, we passed this shop that I looked at the clothes and I really got drawn to it, and Sean asked me if I wanted to try them on. At first I said no, I couldn't, because the clothes that I saw were these bright clothes. There was just this bright orange top, and growing up in Zimbabwe, I never typically wore bright colors. I wore dark grays and blacks to blend in, even though I did love color. From time to time, my mom actually made us clothes that were really colorful, but for my choice, I would always choose things that would help me blend in and not stick out. And so Sean actually encouraged me to try it on. It was this perfect fit, and it was a tight-fitting orange top that hugged my body, and I'd never worn anything like it. And I felt so good. I'd never felt that amazing in clothes before. I'd been used to wearing box t-shirts, box shirts, and this was a nice tight hugging a t-shirt, and I just loved it. And Sean bought it for me, and I think I probably would have worn it nearly every day. Yes, I washed it from time to time, but that was just another case of having permission to explore something outside the narrow path. So coming to Australia was just fantastic. It was really wondrous, full of opportunity and possibility and hope. Like I could do anything. I felt free. Finally, I felt free. I didn't have to walk and follow the narrow path anymore. I could explore different opportunities and possibilities for myself. I was given permission to do that. And that is what I loved about coming to Australia. When I finished my year 12, all of that possibility was going to be taken away. As my time at Kingswood College came to an end and I was completing year 12, it was a very exciting time for many of the students, even me to begin with. It was a time when we get to choose what careers we wanted to pursue, what fields of study we wanted to pursue at university, and I was also in that game. I had put down applications to study biomedical science, law, arts, science, computer science. So I was really excited for what was possible for me. However, there were some huge obstacles that were closing in on me to rob me of these opportunities and possibilities. The first one was, even if I got in to a university here in Australia, I couldn't afford to go. And Andrew, my uncle, could not afford to pay for my school fees. My fees at Kingswood College were $6,000 a year. To go to university, I'd have to pay between $12,000 to $20,000. We just could not afford that. Secondly, even if I got in to a university and applied for a scholarship, in Australia, very, very few universities give scholarships to international students. So the likelihood and the chances of that happening were very slim. So this was meant to be a time of excitement, possibility, and opportunity, just like my fellow classmates. But for me, it was a time of fear because my future was uncertain. To make things worse, in Zimbabwe, the situation was escalating. The University of Zimbabwe was closed. There was no food in the shops. My mom had to start working in South Africa and bring food back into the country so that my dad, brother, and my sister could survive. If I were to go back to Zimbabwe, I would be going back to absolutely nothing. I was terrified of that possibility. I remember walking to one of my classes and my principal, Mrs. Annette Bennett, came up to me and she told me to come over, and I rushed over to her, and then she said to me, so what are you thinking about regarding your future and going to university? I looked at her and I said that I had no resources to go to university and that the University of Zimbabwe was closed and that I would not have a future really in Zimbabwe. She stopped, she paused, and then she said to me, would it be okay if I shared your story in the school newsletter? And maybe some of the parents and the community may want to support you inside of going to university. In that moment, I stopped, and in a split second, I said to myself, do not say yes. You've already been a burden enough to so many people's generosity. In that same split second, I said, there's nothing for me to lose. And I said to Mrs. Bennett, yes, that would be great. When I saw this newsletter, I became really tense. My shoulders tensed, my chest constricted. I was really scared. My whole story was in this letter, and I had no idea whether people were going to support me or not. All my hopes and dreams were in this one story. This story was going to determine the rest of my life. A few days after the newsletter had been sent out to the entire Kingswood community, Mrs. Bennett calls me into her office. I remember rushing to her office again and waiting in the lobby, and then entering her office, and in the office there's another lady, and I'm introduced to her. She is Mrs. Kennedy, and she's the mother of one of my friends, Richard Kennedy. And Mrs. Kennedy had read my newsletter, and she had traveled and lived in Africa, so she was really connected to my story and wanted to help out. And you know, what then happens next is I'm in the office with Mrs. Bennett and Mrs. Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy asks me, what do I want to do? And I tell her that I want to study law, and I want to study law at Monash University. Then she asks me if I had met the enter score. I looked at her slightly nervous and slightly embarrassed and ashamed, and I said, no, I have 92.65 as my enter score, but I need to have got 95 to be able to enter into Monash Law. She looks at me and says, that's okay. We are going to go to Monash University and we're going to find out for ourselves if you can get a place to do law. I was so touched. When Mrs. Kennedy and I arrived at Monash University, we went directly to the admissions office. We met with this wonderful lady who was very, very helpful. And Mrs. Kennedy took charge and explained my family situation. And then she asked the admissions officer if there were any scholarships available for international students. The admissions officer said no. My heart sank. That door was now closed. The admissions officer then asked me what my enter score was, and I explained to her that it was 92.65. She stopped, she opened her book, went through the pages, found law, and the enter score was meant to be 95. And she said, well, the enter score is 95, so you haven't actually met the cutoff. I was embarrassed and nervous and ashamed because I'd failed. I failed to meet the cutoff. Then she says that there hadn't been many international students actually applying to do law, so there were many places available, and that they could offer me a place to study law. I was so shocked. This impossibility of doing law was now becoming a reality. I had been given a place at Monash University to study law. Mrs. Kennedy and I were so excited that my dream was going to be made a reality. Not only was I going to do law, I was actually going to do a double degree. I was going to do arts and law, a double degree. That's unheard of in Zimbabwe. I was going to go to university and come out with 2 degrees. Despite me getting a place at Monash Law, Andrew had concerns about me staying in Australia. Though Australia is a wealthy country and is a land of opportunity, his main concern was that Australia was going to corrupt me. Growing up in Zimbabwe and not necessarily having wealth and material goods did not always mean that people were not happy. People would find joy inside of their life no matter what their circumstances were. So Andrew really wanted to preserve that purity, that I would not become a materialistic person, but really be grounded in my family values that had me be the man I am today. And so I had to make a stand for myself that I wanted to go to university here in Australia and that I had to find my own path in that regard, because by this stage, Andrew was not going to be able to financially support me in this second part of my journey. After getting into Monash University, the next obstacle was funding. How in the world was I going to raise the funds to go to university? My first year alone was going to cost over $14,000 in just fees, let alone the books and living expenses. And consequent years, my fees were going to be around $20,000 to $25,000 a year. It seemed insurmountable. However, Mrs. Kennedy once again had my back. She arranged this dinner where she invited people from the Kingswood community. Parents came along, teachers came along, friends of parents came along, and she had organized to have this dinner in this African restaurant in Brunswick. And as I arrive, my heart is racing because my future is going to be determined by the people in this room. As I walk into that door, there were about 30 to 40 people seated, all looking at me, big broad smiles, and I was so nervous. I was only 18 years old at this time, and I'm asking all these sea of white faces to contribute thousands of dollars so that I could potentially have a future here in Australia. Was I good enough? Was I worthy enough? Would I be good enough to actually succeed at this? That whole night was a blur as I was so nervous. What I do remember was Mrs. Kennedy sharing my story, the circumstances in Zimbabwe, and I believe a sheet of paper was passed along where people got to write their names and their commitment. That night, people made a commitment of over $14,000 so that I, Rugare Rwashe Gomo, could go to university. I was profoundly shocked, paralyzed, and moved. Little me from Zimbabwe was again going to have another opportunity to fulfill his dreams. So finally, we've raised the funds to go to university, but there's still another obstacle. The obstacle is my visa. So I came to Australia on a 2-year visa. It was a visa that allowed me to finish my high school, and I now needed to get a new visa which would allow me to go to university for the next 5 years, because my degree, my double degree in arts and law, was a 5-year program. The problem was that within those 2 years of me coming to Australia, the situation in Zimbabwe had dramatically changed. There was no food in the country. There was long queues for fuel. The University of Zimbabwe had closed. And there were also the land invasions. So the white commercial farms were now being invaded, and some white farmers and lots of white farmers were being killed, as well as the people working on the farms. and there was now an influx of Zimbabwean refugees into Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, the United States. What that meant was that Zimbabwe had stopped being a safe country for immigration purposes. To put some context, if you were immigrating from the United Kingdom or Europe, you were seen as a Category 1 national. That means a safe country to come to Australia to study, because that meant that it was very unlikely to overstay your visa. Zimbabwe had moved from Category 2 all the way to Category 4, which meant that I was now deemed, for immigration purposes, as a high risk of overstaying my visa. How the Australian government then dealt with people in Category 4 was that they needed to then show that they had proof of funds to support themselves financially in Australia. People in Category 1 didn't have to show that they could support themselves. Where was I going to get the funds to show the Australian government that I could support myself? Again, it felt like an impossibility. Andrew couldn't show those funds. It was too much money. It was around $15,000 you had to show. Once again, a member in the Kingswood community said that they were willing to support me and that they were willing to actually be my guardian while I studied and show the Australian government that they had funds to support me. All $15,000. And this was a family that had migrated from Singapore to Australia. So she herself had a daughter at the school who was studying, and she had heard of my story, and she wanted to be able to contribute to the success of my life. And so she volunteered to be my guardian during this time and would show all the paperwork of the funds that were required by the Australian government for me to stay in Australia. This was another miracle. My community, strangers in my community, rising up for my dream to be fulfilled. I put in my application for my visa. I provide them with my university, a letter for acceptance. I provide them with proof of payment of my school fees. I provide them with my living expenses. I put in my visa application and I wait. Will I get a visa? Several weeks later, I get this email, visa granted. My heart is full of joy. I have a visa for 5 years in my passport. That means I have 5 years again to start creating my future. Obtaining this visa and this opportunity to go to university was impossible. It should never have happened. I didn't get the right enter score. I did not have the funds to go to university. I had no money for my living expenses. Yet, in my passport, in my hand, there's this orange label saying visa granted for 5 years so that I can pursue an arts law degree. When I started law school, I had no friends from Kingswood College. They were all doing different degrees at different universities or in different faculties. So I was the only student at Kingswood College doing law at Monash University. I was alone. In my first year of law school, in addition to being in a new environment, not having my community, I had to work long hours in my holidays to raise funds for my school fees, for my textbooks, for my living expenses. That was really challenging. When people would invite me to socialize, I would typically say I was unavailable because I had to go to my next shift at McDonald's. So in my first year, it was really hard creating a community, because not only did I have to study to keep up, but I had the extra challenge of having to raise my next $20,000 to get into my second year of university. That is not what a typical student at law school was dealing with.